Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
And welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. Today I am your host, Karl Cassell, President and CEO of Horizons, a Family Service Alliance. Thank you for joining us this morning. Today we're going to discuss the subject of mandatory minimum sentences. The proliferation in recent decades of mandatory minimum penalties for federal crimes, along with the tremendous increase in the prison population, has forced those concerned with criminal justice in America to reconsider this age-old question. Today with me I have three attorneys that will offer their perspective and help us talk through this often called controversial issue. To my immediate left we have Keith Ull, criminal defense attorney. Good morning.
Good morning.
Next to him we have Bob Rush, attorney here in Cedar Rapids. Good morning.
Good morning.
And Peter Deegan, Jr., assistant U.S. attorney. Good morning.
Good morning, Carl.
Well, we'll jump right into the questions. I appreciate you guys joining us today. And so let's just start with kind of how this all came to be. Where did mandatory minimum sentences begin, and are you in favor of their continuance? Why or why not? You can start anywhere.
Well, interestingly, I looked at mandatory minimum sentences as far as how many statutes they're on the book. There's 186 mandatory minimum sentences in the United States Code. The first one goes back to about 1774 for piracy. I assume we're talking more today about the drug legislation, and I think you have to trace the beginning of the concept of mandatory minimum sentences after they were abolished in the late 60s to the Federal Sentencing Guidelines Act in 1984. That didn't have any minimum sentences in it per se, but it set up a range which at that point in time was purportedly going to be not too discretionary for federal judges. And then shortly after that, Congress superimposed on that mandatory minimums in 1986. For my readings, it would appear that a lot of the impetus for the mandatory sentences was that after the Republicans got such a good job promoting the issue in '84, Lenny Bias died of a cocaine case up in Boston. Tip O'Neill saw it as a opportunity for the Democrats. They quickly ran it through the House, the Democrat-controlled House, and the Republican-controlled Senate. Both sides wanted to get on this tough-on-crime bandwagon. Passed the act just very shortly before the November 1986 elections. And since that time, mandatory minimums have expanded to pornography cases, gun cases, cases with children, airplane hijacking, and terrorism. So it's just grown, as you say, since it got back into vogue.
Just to add to that, I think the political impetus behind it had to do with a desire to see more uniformity in sentencing. That was part of the driver. And I think the bigger driver had to do with the politicians flexing their muscle, saying, we want to get tough on crime and make sure that people aren't walking the streets that should be locked up.
I agree that I think in the context of drug crimes, you can kind of look to about 1986 to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and that's kind of where we see the beginning of the mandatory minimums in the drug context that are such a topic of discussion today. I think they have been scaled back in small bites since then a little bit. Back in 1994, there was an amendment that allowed for a safety valve.
Yes.
And what the safety valve does is says if you have a low criminal history, you didn't use guns or violence or a threat of violence, and a few other criteria, including a truthful interview with law enforcement, then you aren't going to be subject to a mandatory minimum sentence. Since that time, to address disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, there was another amendment that changed the ratios to try to make it a little more fair. But I think the Department of Justice's position is more still needs to be done, and that's why the Department supports legislation to curtail and limit mandatory minimum sentences even further, while keeping them an essential part of law enforcement going forward.
Thank you, all of you, for those answers. Mr. Deegan, you brought up the Justice Safety Valve Act. Explain what that is of 2013 and the Smarter Sentencing Act for those who aren't aware of those new laws and where they come from.
Well, the Safety Valve Act that I was talking about actually goes back to 1994, and that's been in place for quite a number of years. And what that does is says if you have a minimal criminal history, and again, you haven't used violence or firearms, there's been no resulting death or serious bodily injury from your drug offense, and you provide a truthful interview with law enforcement, then you can be sentenced without regard to a mandatory minimum sentence. But in addition, the Smarter Sentencing Act, which is, that's the version of sentencing reform that's now in the Senate, it's been endorsed by the Department of Justice. What that act would do is, in broad strokes, take the mandatory minimums and have them, in many instances, to make them not quite as long, but also provide for potential retroactive relief, so that a prosecutor or a defense attorney could petition to have a sentence reduced if it would have been a lesser under the law as as the department hopes it gets passed. But that hasn't gone into effect yet. There's still a lot of debate about whether that'll become law or not.
Certainly. Anything to add on either one of those?
For viewers' sake, the key person on any change in the law happens to be an Iowan.
Yes.
Chairman of the Judiciary Committee is Senator Grassley, so I would urge viewers to communicate their views to our senator.
Well, and that's part of the reason I wrote that editorial for the Constitution Project. It was because of Senator Grassley's main role. And I'm informed just recently, much to the senator's good actions, that he, while still resisting a decrease of the mandatory minimum sentences themselves, is now actively working on the other parts of the Smarter Sentencing Act to get that in place. That Smarter Sentencing Act would, in some ways, increase the opportunities under the Safety Valve Act for some technical issues about whether you have 2 criminal history points or 1 criminal history point. I can say, as a defense lawyer, the safety valve as it exists has been very important to some of my clients. It's not just some arbitrary law out there, but the safety valve has been put into use, both in the northern and southern districts of Iowa, to the benefits of Iowans.
Karl, I think one of the issues that people need to be aware of under the current system of sentencing, much of the discretion that a judge had over sentencing has been taken away from that judge and shifted either to these guidelines, but in large part, I would submit, has been shifted to the prosecutors and the charges that they can bring that include mandatory minimum sentences, so that charging power of a prosecutor is really not reviewable, and that has been a subject of criticism.
And that's part of the Smart on Crime initiative of the Department of Justice, initiated by former Attorney General Holder, but certainly continuing under Attorney General Lynch. The part of the Smart on Crime initiative is to try to standardize across the nation a more fair approach to applying mandatory minimum sentences. And to do that, there's been specific criteria set out so that prosecutors now have to look at a little more critically at individual cases to see whether or not they should charge a case in a way that would implicate a mandatory minimum sentence. In our office in the Northern District of Iowa, this is something we've been trying to do for quite a while, and we feel like we've had some success. If you look at the people that are being released on federal supervised release, the people that have completed their federal sentences out of our district, they have what we call an RPI, or a risk predictor index, which is about the 13th out of the 94 districts in the nation. And what that tells us is that these folks, and that's based largely on criminal history, that we're targeting the right folks. The right folks are being prosecuted in federal court. They come out, they do have serious criminal histories, and they're going to need quite a bit on supervised release. But as a department, the department is now trying to standardize this so that all offices across the nation are looking a little more closely at this issue and making sure that we're being as fair as we can be when it comes to charging mandatory minimums.
Well, and what General Holder did and the way it's being applied here in Iowa is very important, because the mandatory minimums as they exist without these administrative oversights are purely quantity driven. So if you have a mule or a co-conspirator with the same amount of drugs as the leader and organizer, when it comes to the mandatory minimums, or that young lady that's just holding the drugs, when that comes to the mandatory minimums, you're looking at the same sentence. So the uniformity has been created as to weight, but it hasn't been created as to justice. Right. But that's the issue that everybody's trying to work on together.
I think that's right, Keith.
So let me ask this question as we talk about the problem. What problem does it solve or intend to solve, and does it work?
Well, let me suggest this, and I'd ask Pete this. What do we know about the recidivism rate of people coming through the federal system?
Well, in what particular regard? Are you talking about folks that return to drug crimes or
any crimes?
Yeah.
I mean, is it working? I think that's a fundamental question that we should all be asking ourselves. And the longer people spend in prison, some say the more skills they develop on what to do once they come back out of prison.
I think that's a good point. And part of the Smarter Sentencing Act legislation, again, which the department has endorsed, would say that we still need mandatory minimums. And there's a couple good reasons for that, and I'll get back to your point in just a second. One of them is that the certainty in sentencing, it has a certain deterrent effect that you can't really get if you take it away. In other words, if people know that they are going to go to prison for certain offenses of a certain level, that's an important aspect of crime prevention and crime deterrence. Now, on the flip side, the department has looked at it and said it doesn't have to be as long, and that once you hit a certain point, then it can be counterproductive. In Texas, North Carolina, and Georgia, there's been sentencing reform that has reduced the mandatory minimums, and they've actually been able to lower their crime rates because people aren't necessarily spending as much time in prison, but they're still able to maintain that deterrent effect and still deter crime. Going back to why mandatory minimums remain an important part of the equation, though, is there's also a fairness aspect. Yep. And where you have no mandatory guidelines in particular, you might have a situation where people that are convicted of the same offense and may be similarly situated, somebody might get one sentence, but in front of a different judge might get another sentence. One benefit of mandatory minimums is it sets, if they're appropriately low, it sets a standard that is going to be imposed in all cases so that nobody gets a break that maybe would be unfair compared to somebody else.
Let me throw in just a caveat, but those who provide information to law enforcement, they would be in line to have a mandatory minimum, but they're giving less time because, as common vernacular is, they snitched. They provided information to law enforcement, and so now their sentence is reduced. Is that fair? Why or why not?
Absolutely, that's fair. And I wouldn't call it, as a criminal defense lawyer, my clients do that all the time. And that's how they avoid the mandatory minimums. And as opposed to calling it snitching, it's cooperating with the United States of America to help solve crime. Once you agree to do substantial assistance, you and the United States Attorney's Office become allies, and you're working together to reduce crime. And for those people, and ironically, the mandatory minimums have in some way helped the large dealers better than the smaller dealers because they have more information to give. And that information that they have compared to a mule or some girlfriend is a commodity that they can sell to reduce their sentence. I'm all for the ability of what's called 5K1, substantial assistance, so that defendants, particularly my defendants, can learn the first step toward rehabilitation. And sometimes that starts with helping the United States of America solve other crimes.
And Keith hits on a good point. Rehabilitation is oftentimes lost in the political debate. The political debate is too often focused on the punishment aspect of criminal sentencing. I think we have to remind ourselves that rehabilitation is also an objective from criminal sentencing. That sometimes is lost in the process.
And the other thing that gets lost, we forget to talk about treatment, because a lot of these people sell drugs to support their own habits. I'm not talking about the big cartels, but a lot of these people sell drugs to support their own habits. And if you get those people treated, you take them out of the supply and demand chain and reduce the amount of people out there selling the drugs. There's a RAND study that shows that you get more, quote, bang for your buck for treating people than just keeping them housed in prisons. And I agree 100% with the fact that there should be certainty. But as you say, if you're facing a 10-year sentence and you reduce that to a 5-year sentence with the Smarter Sentencing Act would do, you can still get a lot of certainty there too.
That's right.
Okay, thank you guys for that. So we are concentrating on mandatory minimums and how they affect those who are involved in drug crime. So I want to continue that at some level by talking about the effect it has on communities, state, federal budgets, crime rates, but first, how it affects certain communities specifically, and poor and minority communities. As we talk about the drugs, and you bring up cartels, we don't see a lot of news about cartels being brought down, and my assumption is if you trace it back, you'll be able to find where it's coming from. Cocaine, heroin don't grow around the way. There needs to be a pretty large organization to make sure these drugs get here. But what effect does it have on those communities? And are we doing something, which is kind of a piggyback, to run it up the food chain, to really figure out who's dealing the drugs, not the street dealers, but the folks who are really supplying the country with our drugs?
Well, it's very difficult to get to the cartel dealers, but I've had cases where they've been doing $12 million worth of methamphetamine wholesale a year, or 200,000 worth of cocaine a month. And you can at least start to trace it back. You can get it from who's bringing it into Iowa to where it's coming from in the barrios of Los Angeles. From there, you can get it down about how it's coming in from Mexico into here. And you can start working, chipping your way back there. The international drug enforcement is probably outside of my criminal defense work and your jurisdiction. But what we have here in Iowa, we can start working back the best we can, and people that are caught in that level, I've had, except those who are worried about being shot, and I've only had one attempt to kill one of my clients. When you explain to them how much 85% of 20 years is versus all the benefits you can get from substantial assistance. Senator Grassley is absolutely correct on that point. Not so much the length of the time, but if you want to convince a drug dealer to talk to the government, simply explain to him what 85% of a mandatory minimum is compared to all the benefit you can get, not only helping the government, but for yourself if you cooperate.
And Keith's an old federal prosecutor from days old, but and knows that the goal has always been to go up the chain and get the folks that are truly profiting, truly injecting these drugs into our society. But I think there's been an evolution of thinking to say, look, there's a way we can do this without the tremendous human cost of putting the lower level folks in prison for mandatory prison time when it really doesn't serve a particular end. There, we ought to be looking at rehabilitation. We ought to be looking at treatment more than long prison sentences. So the goal would be to make these, make the mandatory minimums a little more precise and not so severe in certain instances, while at the same time for the worst offenders, the violent folks and the folks that are truly responsible for the large amount of drugs coming into our communities, those mandatory minimums would still be there to help address those folks and hopefully move up the chain to try to prosecute those folks.
Excuse me, Carl, over half of the people who are inmates in the federal system are in there on drug offenses. At what cost to the taxpayers to keep people locked up for year after year after year? We ought to start talking about that. That's an important factor. We need to look at recidivism rates for people that spend extended periods of time in prison. Is that helping or not?
Well, and that's why you're absolutely right. That's why some of the conservatives in the House and Senate are coming on board. Housing people in prison costs a lot of money.
Yes, it does.
And number one, not only does it cost a lot of money to keep them there now, but if you have people with these 20-year sentences where you only get a 15% credit, the federal government is approaching the danger of running a geriatric ward because that prison population is aging. Yep. When you say who does this affect the worst, I know there's a lot of discussion about Jim Crow laws and how this affects minorities, yep. And it does. I'd like to mention one other one that I've seen it personally truly affect, and I know that's why both of our U.S. attorneys in Iowa are trying to amend the way they approach this. That's these young, uneducated women that get stuck holding the drugs or the guns or having the safe house. And if it's solely quantity driven, they are exposed to the same level of punishment as the fellow out in the barrios bringing it in from Mexico. Right. And they get sucked into that because they've never seen money before. They've never got to go to a fancy party before. They've never got a trip to Los Angeles before. Yes, they have to do something to have criminal intent, but the whole system is skewed against those people on mandatory minimums.
We have about 3 or 4 minutes left, and so I want to just ask a couple questions because we have kind of talked about the issue, but talk about the unintended consequences Since this was created, if we could quickly as we wrap up, have there been unintended consequences, and if so, what are they?
Well, number one, we've touched on, and that's the cost of locking people up for long periods of time. The cost to the taxpayer, not to mention the cost of keeping somebody from re-entering the world as a functioning citizen. We lose that.
And I think the flip side of that, too, is money that might be used to house people for longer and longer prison sentences can be moved within the budget to help with reentry programs that can help folks that are reentering society hopefully get on the right track, and also prevention, outreach to young folks to try to send the message that there's a better way to go. All of that takes resources, and as we know, we're responsible as the folks in the government are responsible for making sure we spend our money wisely.
In a perverse sense, I always try when I debrief my clients to find independent sources of information to verify what they have to say. So when I present my information to the government can see that I have separate sources. But it's taught everybody about perjury. One of the best ways to get substantial assistance is make sure you talk about your buddy getting above a higher quantity, so you connect him with a mandatory minimum. You want to try to make him a kingpin, and we've created a system. This is not a boys' town. He's not heavy father, he's my brother. It's unfortunately sometimes saying lies to get a lower sentence for yourself. So there's a lot of potential perjury created by these mandatory minimums. They still are an incredible bargaining tool.
There's a creeping development in state law. We've been talking only about federal law here, but state law now, more and more mandatory minimums, and without a criminal sentencing commission. So we've got part-time legislators making these decisions because they're tough on crime.
Well, we've run out of time for today. I wish we had at least another hour and a half to discuss it, but I want to thank each of my panelists for joining us this morning. Thank you, the viewer, for joining, and just know that we need to temper the law with some equity. We shouldn't be so rigid, and really consider each person and each crime accordingly. Thank you for watching Ethical Perspectives on the News today. I'm your host, Karl Cassell. We hope to see you back again next week. Good morning.
Thanks, Karl.
Thank you.